I suggest we give 30 more seconds. People are still joining.
All right, I think we are ready to start, given that we only have an hour for this briefing. So once again, a very warm welcome to all of you to this press briefing organized by Climate Action Network. CAN is a network of 1,900 civil society groups in over 150 countries, together fighting the climate crisis. We're holding this press briefing today on the important issue of loss and damage, which has been a priority for our network and will be an extremely important issue that will also come up at COP28 in Dubai. Before I introduce our speakers who will elaborate on this issue, just a few reminders. This call is being recorded, and as I said, will last for an hour. We will have opening remarks and presentation from our speakers, and then we will open the floor for questions. If you already have questions that you know you would like to put to the panel, feel free to type them into the chat box, and then when we get to the questions, we'll take them in order. Of course, you can also just take the floor and introduce yourselves. It would also be useful if you can, on the Zoom interface where you see your name, there are 3 small dots. If you can indicate the organization that you're representing or the media organization that you're representing so that we have an overview of who is on the call. Now I would like to introduce our panel. We're really delighted today to have with us former Federal Minister for Climate Change in Pakistan, Sherry Rehman, who is named by Time magazine as one of 100 most influential people in 2023. Many of you may recall at the UN climate talks in 2022 last year in Egypt, she led the delegation of 77 developing nations plus China, the G77 plus China, to successfully negotiate the loss and damage fund to pay for climate damages that many of these countries have been facing for decades. We're also joined by Lian Kalatek, Associate Director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, Harjeet Singh, Head of the Global Political Strategy Unit at Climate Action Network International, and Nishani Jayamaha, who is Learning and Climate Change Program Coordinator at the International Council of Voluntary Agencies. I want to thank all our speakers for being here. And before we start with opening remarks from Minister Rehman, I just want to hand it over to Harjeet to very quickly set the context for today's briefing. And once again, thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much, Dharni. And I won't take much time, but I just want to remind everybody how historic the decision was at COP27 last year in Sharm el-Sheikh on establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, for which we have been fighting for several years and decades. So this year is extremely important. We started working on the operationalization of the fund. It started at a very positive note in March this year, but I must tell you, after 6 months of intense engagement, it seems we are almost back to the square one. Across so many issues, there is disagreement between developed and developing countries, which means we are at a very critical juncture. As you know, the Transitional Committee is meeting again. The last meeting is happening in Egypt next week. We really need to make sure that it delivers. And we will share more details shortly in terms of what the disagreements are. But before that, I must invite Her Excellency, former Federal Minister for Climate Change, Pakistan Senator Ms. Sherry Rehman, to share her opening remarks. And who played, yeah.
Thank you very much, Harjeet, and all of you for bearing with me. I think I just want to say very briefly a couple of things, and perhaps I should wait for the briefing to go further. Why? Because, but you know, I'll just go ahead and share some thoughts. One is that, of course, you know, when this Loss and Damage Fund was created in the early hours of the last Sharm el-Sheikh COP27, we called it historic because it was an acknowledgement of the bargain between the global north and the global south in terms of the fact that it reflects an understanding on 2 key concepts. One, that averting loss and damage is necessary, and that is not the role of this fund, but it is a function of connectivity across all pathways that we talk about. And the Paris Agreement, of course, addresses all this. It addresses mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Yet we now have been watching the world accelerate climate impacts, and many countries are showing enhanced fragility as the world turns, as time goes by, and our talking points start falling behind the frequency and scale and magnitude of climate change, that the business of providing or creating this loss and damage fund or bringing resources that will minimize the losses and damages that countries face, and mine was one of them last year in losing 1/3 of our country to a huge flood. But then many countries in 2023 saw an accelerated climate impact on their economies, on their people, and basically, all in all, the growing fragility of ecosystems, of populations, indigenous and otherwise, who are the most vulnerable, including women and children, are in particularly these developing countries, are facing impacts without any transfer of resources from the north, from the developing countries. That is the premise of this bargain, and are continuing to face impacts that they don't even understand. So when we say loss and damage has been created as a fund, okay, it was, as I said, a down payment on our futures. Now that down payment through this last year was meant to be operationalized with transparency and terms of references that were inclusive, that acknowledged the level and scale and unpredictability of climate change, its magnitude and its frequency, and therefore was able to, with speed and scale, provide the support that is needed to the economies and public and populations of countries which are now feeling the burn increasingly and are facing what many of us feel, the eroding power of climate change on their lifestyles, on their incomes, and on their ability to even build up any resilience to a future that is almost dangerous in many parts to many countries. So all in all, I'm saying that the work of the transitional committees, which has been, I'm sure it's been intense, now needs to be open. It needs to be transparent. It needs to, frankly, it should be live streamed so that there is clarity on what the goals are, what the obstacles continue to be. If are they deepening, are they getting worse, or are we finding a path to joint solutions? Secondly, in the search for common ground that loss and damage discussions and all discussions involve, the eligibility already of which countries can be liable to receive the compensations or the resource shifts or that loss and damage incurs to make populations less vulnerable and able to face the impacts of climate change with resilience, that needs to be enumerated as a more inclusive, in a more inclusive category of terms of reference that are being created. Because our fear is that countries are being judged by old development indices, where countries like Libya and Pakistan, which don't fall into LDCs or are not a small island state that is sinking, but have already seen disasters that they cannot seek immediate recovery from without sustained external help, will not be able to be eligible to this loss and damage fund. So we were told that it is still fairly exclusionary. We also don't know why it is taking so long. Is it a crisis of political will again? Or is it something that can be addressed in terms of capacity and more of a knowledge base brought to the decision-making table? My question is that in the provision of support that loss and damage entails, the loss and damage in the plenary stocktake must also be amped up and elevated as an item that is equal to the adaptation and mitigation formulations and work plans that dominate the global stocktake and the global conferencing that we do. Because without this level of amplification to the subject, I'm sorry, loss and damage will end up falling into what I call the Cinderella slot, which adaptation as a work plan often ends up being. I mean, right at the tail end of the conference, and it just doesn't get a priority. So not that mitigation work plans have achieved much. And lastly, I just want to say that at the same conference, I mean, this is a pivotal moment, okay? Timing is everything. If the moment passes, consider the message we are giving of retreat from Paris goals, other ambitions, as well as the pledges the whole world has made to each other. So if we are not able to commit to support that operationalizes this plan with clear goals, timelines, and terms of reference, that define eligibility with inclusion, that define how it is triggered, whether it, the divide between the slow onset nature of disasters or the trigger that the scale of unpredictable disasters that trigger widespread humanitarian crises, so all these problems, as well as how to, and I'm ending here, as well as how to capitalize this plan and how to replenish this plan. Capitalization and replenishment go together as much as eligibility for drawing on this fund will matter. So I think with these few remarks, I want to sort of, there are no rocket science here, just sort of put things back on the table and say, well, in the end, all our work plans and the subject heads we want to operationalize, whether in transitional committees or at the global stocktake, they are all cross-sectoral and interconnected. They must not be put in silos. What has allowed I fear otherwise that the loss and damage fund will be a passing fancy, and it will just become what I call a ghost fund, meaning it's a fund like the global goal on adaptation. It's not capitalized and it's barely used. We do not want that, nor can we afford that as the world turns. Thank you.
Many thanks, Senator Rahman, for your opening remarks and your leadership on this issue. So we will now have a presentation to get more in depth into what is happening with the discussions and negotiations on the design of the fund. So I'll invite Harjeet, Lian, and Nishani to go through the presentation. Just give us 30 seconds to get the presentation on the screen, which my colleague is sharing. We hope all of you can see it. And with that, I will hand it over to our next speakers.
Thank you, Dharni, and thank you very much, Senator Rahman, for really laying it out, and particularly talking about loss and damage not being a silo issue.
We've lost, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I just lost you there for a minute, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, I was just saying, thank you very much, Senator Rahman, for really laying that out and particularly highlighting that loss and damage should not be a standalone issue or siloed. It has to be connected across various parts of the negotiation that are happening right now. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just to remind everybody that the loss and damage that we are facing right now is a result of rich countries' failure to live up to their responsibilities. And that's where it's not just about delaying the conversation on loss and damage finance, but that's where, as Sherry ma'am said, it's connected with mitigation, it's connected with adaptation. If we are not reducing emissions, if we continue to see temperatures rising, and if we don't provide support to communities and countries to adapt, we will see much more loss and damage. So we have to make sure that when we talk about loss and damage finance, it has to be put into the context of overall ambition on mitigation. So staying below 1.5 degree, helping countries to adapt and making sure countries and communities who are facing these climate impacts have enough resources to recover. And after this 30-year-long fight, we got this decision on loss and damage fund. As part of the process, a transitional committee was created last year, and with the agenda to have 4 meetings and 2 workshops. We've already finished 3 meetings, and next week we are going to have the final transitional committee meeting, which is going to be quite decisive, hopefully. Next slide, please. So just to remind everybody, the mandate that was given to the transitional committee was to establish the institutional arrangements, modalities, structure, governance, and terms of reference for the fund. And that's what this committee is supposed to be doing, alongside defining the new funding arrangements, which I'll speak to later. So the decision was about the fund as well as new funding arrangements which fall outside UNFCCC. It's also about identifying and expanding the sources of funding. We all know that we are talking about a very different scale of finance. The estimates are that we will need $290 to $580 billion per year in developing countries alone by 2030, which means we need hundreds of billions of dollars every year. And the devastation that we saw in Pakistan or in Libya or Nigeria, Malawi, tells us that the scale is massive, and we are not looking at just a couple of $1 million here. And then the coordination and complementarity with existing funding arrangements. Next slide. So as Sherry ma'am was saying, that we have not really been able to finish our work. So what's really holding us back? And this is a preview of the number of issues that we are facing. Contributor base, who will pay, eligibility, who will receive funding, which you also alluded to, location of the fund, whether it should be under World Bank or as an operating entity, priority should be given to fund or funding arrangements, governance issues, and also sources of finance. So I will now invite Liana to talk about these issues in a bit more detail. Of course, we can cover later. Also conscious that Sherry ma'am may have to leave early. So we'll just give you a snapshot. So Liana, over to you to talk about positions of different countries.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's just really important to highlight, as the minister has and as Harjeet have, that this is really, and the discussion on the loss and damage fund is really related to the broader negotiations and the broader discourses related to finance and finance provision in the UNFCCC and under the Paris Agreement. So the global stocktake, but also the discussions about the new collective quantified goal on climate finance to supersede the 100 billion per year post 2025 that are ongoing. And so it's in this context, and what you see here is a quick overview over the different positions by countries and country groups through submissions that have been made through the Transitional Committee. You can find those when you look at the Transitional Committee website. And some of the core issues, and again, this is actually where the technical is actually the political, are related to the principles where you have a developing country position, G77 and China, also Pakistan, that it needs to be under the UNFCCC's principle and country-driven, which means that it's supposed to be guided by equity, by common and differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, that core provisions that guide the fund, that guide the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. This obviously, when you put those principles aside, and again from the EU sides and the US sides, there is some general reference to transparency and accountability. You hear a lot about efficiency and effectiveness, but you do not hear a reliance on those core principles. And in a way, you notice that there is really the effort to try to distance whatever discussions is going on from those core principles. The core principles, of course, have a direct relation to the discussion of who you see as the main contributors to the fund. Very clear from developing country sides that we see that as a core provision of public finance sources and grant and non-debt creating finance sources that come from developed countries primarily. versus when you look at it from the EU and the US point of view, this is a discussion about all parties in a position to do so, which actually does away with the clear differentiation of responsibilities of developed and developing countries, again, under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. The flip side of this coin is then the discourse on eligibility, whereas developing countries, and as pointed out by the minister earlier, including Pakistan and China, but the G77 more generally, point out that all developing countries should be eligible because vulnerabilities is not related to certain country groups, and that particularly communities and affected people, vulnerable people, can be found in all developing countries and should be supported and have a right to be supported in all developing countries. The EU, particularly in their proposal, tries to basically define what vulnerability means by restricting that to some particular country groups, namely the LDCs and CIT, while allowing that, some other vulnerable countries could be considered based on yet to define eligibility criteria. Again, this is very different from an understanding, which is actually the language that all developing countries have and are showing vulnerability to the adverse effect of climate change and are therefore deserving of support. Location is a big issue, and again, location is more than just a technical discourse. It's a political question of how much you actually see the closeness, the responsiveness to the convention and the principles from developing country sides, Pakistan, China, G77. We see the necessity as an independent entity, a standalone fund that is also accountable and receives guidance from the COP and the CMA as an operating entity of the financial mechanism of the convention, whereas again from the developed country side in the EU and US proposal, the location is meant to be under a so-called financial intermediary fund hosting with the World Bank hosting the secretariat of the fund, and not an operating entity, so not with that formal and strong link to the financial mechanism of the convention. Next slide. And I think I have probably to speed up a little bit. Again, governance, we mentioned, it's the question of accountability to the convention, to the Paris Agreement, to the parties, and receiving guidance from them. We see that particularly the EU has made the very interesting proposal to basically cut the ties to the COP, to the UNFCCC, to accountability to all parties, and actually see it as something that should be relegated to the Paris Agreement only. On the sources of finance, again, primarily sourced through grant-based public financing from a developing country perspective, whereas both the EU and the US are putting forward that we should have basically a whole set and range of contributors, basically everybody in a condition or willing to do so. And this is actually interpreted very widely to go into subnational governments, private sector philanthropies, but also including innovative sources, particularly voluntary carbon markets or carbon pricing mechanisms, for example. Next slide. Now, again, it is really important. The mandate of the Transitional Committee is to both focus on terms of reference and come up with recommendations of terms of reference for a fund as the heart of the discourse on loss and damage finance and the arrangement from loss and damage finance. But there is quite a bit of a differentiated view between developing countries and developed countries, how actually that complementarity and coherence should be ensured, and who takes the lead in ensuring that there is complementarity and coherence. G77 and China want to ensure that there is actually a central role for the fund in playing that overview role and ensuring complementarity and coherence. The notion of the establishment of a high-level coordination has been brought forward, including by the EU and the US, but with some differentiation. Again, from developing country side, it's seen as an addition to the fund, taking basically the technical complementarity and coherence and guiding role, versus from the EU sides and the US side, just periodically convening council, which the US terms a Resilient Futures Coordination Council, with basically principles of pretty much all other actors under the sun, is seen as the one ensuring complementarity and coherence. And again, that is relevant for the funding arrangements. The question is actually who complements whom. If you see, obviously, the fund as the core and the central actor for addressing loss and damage finance, as the G77 in China does, as Pakistan says, then you obviously want to ensure that the funding arrangement, the actors, particularly outside of the UNFCCC, complement and actually additionally provide funding, but not supersede what is to be provided through the fund. So I think this is crucially important. Just to point out really quickly, from civil society side, there has also been a proposal put forward that is in many of the core issues very closely aligned with what the G77 and China asked for, because we see it as a matter of climate justice. One thing that I want to point out, and I know that both Harjeet and Nishani will talk in more detail about, is that we are really highlighting and are actually pushing all countries to think more about direct access, enhanced direct access, and simplified access modalities for directly affected communities and people, making sure that they can receive money and can actually get that as quickly and as unbureaucratically as possible. And just to mention, there are quite a number of other issues that we don't have on that slide here, but where there are also disagreements between developed and developing countries, which go to the board composition and size, to the scope and programming priorities of the fund, to allocation issues, the question of whether you have windows or whether you have sub-funds that, for example, allow for earmarking, something that we don't want to see as one of the issues. And hopefully we can get to that in the discussion. And with that, I would like to hand it back over to Harjeet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liana. I know it's quite intense, but we really wanted to share that picture with you, that how detailed the proposals are and how there are disagreements. Next slide, please. Liana, I think you may like to cover very quickly about the World
Yeah,
Bank.
sorry, I completely forgot. I just wanted to mention a couple of the issues that we are seeing with the idea of hosting the fund under the World Bank as a fifth with the secretariat there. First of all, to say this is not the same as the Adaptation Fund or the Global Environment Facility, which are likewise World Bank hosted secretariats, because we are looking at a new financial intermediary fund framework that was approved in 2019, and that is actually quite restrictive. And it is not quite clear, although developed countries argues that you would be able to get quite a number of exemptions from that framework, but it's not quite clear how many exemptions the World Bank really would like to grant. One of the core issues for us is that it restricts implementing partners to just multilateral development banks, the IMF and UN agencies. We think this is not fit for purpose. We think this is really not up to date what a new and modern forward-looking fund should be doing. It, for example, also requires World Bank approval for significant changes to the financial intermediary fund once it's set up. And we really see that as an impediment for a fund. And we know we only have one shot at a fund, right? It needs to stand the test of time. We really see that as a potential prohibition or restriction on impacting the options for the fund to grow and evolve. And again, happy to go into more detail later.
Thank you. Yeah, we are going to rush a little bit so that all of you have a chance to interact with Senator Rahman. Next slide, please. And there's a request to share these slides, which we will definitely do. Just to say very quickly, and as I mentioned earlier, the agreement at COP27 was about the fund and funding arrangements. And as many of you know, there's no definition of climate finance being agreed. In that context, we as civil society have put forth a list of criteria so that we can assess whether the finance that is being provided is really loss and damage finance or not. So these criteria that you can see on your screen, we are talking about money that actually, or streams of finance that recognize and aim to comprehensively address loss and damage. It has to be obligatory and compensatory. And as Liana also mentioned, grants and non-debt creating instruments. We can't afford countries to be pushed to take loans. That's going to be double injustice. One, they are facing this reality because of pollution by rich countries and corporations. So we can't expect developing countries to pay for that. It has to be new, additional, predictable, and adequate. It has to be equitably governed and access for all developing countries, participation of affected communities, and it has to acknowledge, respect, and promote intersectional human rights. And in terms of funding arrangements, when we talk to rich countries, they always point towards streams of finance that are outside UNFCCC. And for the reasons, as I mentioned, because it's not obligatory and compensatory, while we acknowledge some streams of finance, which are on the basis of solidarity and compassion, but they are not enough to deal with the problem. And Pakistan was case in point, and now many more countries are facing that reality. I'm going to hand over to Nishani from ICWA. She's going to talk about how humanitarian community looks at it, because it's being expected that they are going to play that role. Let's hear from Nishani how big the challenge is. And now humanitarian community is actually supporting the call for loss and damage. Over to you, Nishani.
Thanks, Haji. Thanks, everyone. It was a good base to start off with. Just for those who don't know who the International Council of Voluntary Agencies, ICWA, is, we were established in 1962, and we're a global network of over 160 local, national, regional, international, non-government organizations and networks that are active in over 160 countries. And so our members in the humanitarian sector are no strangers to responding to disasters. And while we've been typically responding to sudden onset disasters such as, unprecedented and devastating floods in Libya and in Pakistan, multiple cyclones in Mozambique, the Pacific Islands, more and more, the humanitarian sector has been responding to also slow onset events, such as the 6-year drought in the East Horn of Africa, impacting many parts of Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, leading to food insecurity and famine, and the 3-year drought impacting already conflict-affected communities in Afghanistan, not to mention the 3 earthquakes that they just faced, one yesterday. And in 2022 alone, we saw over 387 natural hazards and disasters worldwide, resulting in over 220 billion economic damages, affecting over 185 million people and over 30,000 lives being lost in these calamities. And we are seeing these impacts increasing this year, with obviously Libya and other calamities that we've seen, and climate-induced impact disasters that we faced this year alone. So the challenge in the humanitarian sector is only getting worse. And we see also with not only just what we're facing and what we're seeing day in, day out in our response, is that displacement is also increasing across the world, and particularly in developed and least developed countries. And IPCC synthesis report of this year noted that this is going to be an increasing focus and increasingly frequent and consequential to communities that are going to be affected by climate change. So it's important to also highlight that the loss and damage piece in displacement is an indicator of loss and damage, and communities going through this either due to either economic or non-economic reasons, people don't need to move or want to move. It's a last resort. So as humanitarians who are responding to most often displaced communities, and those who are moving and those who have been displaced by humanitarian or crises of climate impacts and weather impacts, we are struggling in terms of responding. Over the last 20 years, our humanitarian appeals linked to extreme weather events have become 8 times higher. And this is even more, we're responding to these events even more than we are to conflict. And the appeals only have secured less than 50% of the acquired funds that we need to, and the gap is deepening, including with the annual rise of climate-induced crisis. So we're basically looking at funds that are already extremely limited in the humanitarian sector, and it's only going to rise because of obvious climate impacts that we're seeing on communities. And as a result, this is why we've actually come together to call on a joint call for loss and damage funding to be established in ways that we are approaching this in a more holistic approach and not siloed approaches to respond to a crisis that we are not able to handle on our own. Each sector cannot handle this on our own. We need to get together. For the call itself, we've got over 170 organizations from humanitarian, development, climate, and I've also seen some peace-building actors also have signed up to this call. We've got a range of our local national NGOs from Libya, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Yemen, from the East Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Pacific Islands that have signed up. We also see some of the bigger NGOs like Oxfam, Save the Children, CARE, Norwegian Refugee Council, ActionAid, Christian Aid, and a few others, Islamic Relief Worldwide, ADRA, all signing up to this because we see that as a humanitarian community, we are standing together with the climate community for loss and damage finance to be additional to humanitarian finance and to be adequate so that it meets the current and growing future needs of communities impacted by climate change. And the loss and damage fund must be ambitious, and it needs to be accessible by communities and local responders. And it needs to take into account the multiple dimensions of vulnerability and risk facing various contexts. And we've seen this with socio and economic crisis, with insecurity, with conflict. It's multiple crises that people are facing now. And on top of it, climate crisis is exacerbating already vulnerabilities that are extremely high among populations that have not been the cause of climate change. And we wanted to go through a little bit on why we're calling for specific action like access. This is an opportune moment, as Sherry Madam said. A new fund is being established. This is exactly the moment to really make this count. We have to learn from our past experiences. We've seen how the Green Climate Fund operates. We've seen how the humanitarian sector operates with the access. We need to be able to make this fund low risk appetite for local actors and communities to access these funds, and it needs to be able to be simplified, and the access approvals for processes, the complicated reporting, monitoring, evaluation frameworks, and the bureaucratic complexities need to be able to be reduced so that governments and local actors can access them and navigate them. And loss and damage is about people, and it's about communities. It's these same people who are already the first responders to humanitarian crises are now also the first responders to the climate crises. So it's about women trying to rebuild their lives for their communities, for their children, and also seeing local actors and leaders who are the first ones to rebuild after storms and floods when they're hit without so much notice. So we also talk about how does it need to be flexible, timely, predictable, and multi-year funding. And we had a consultation with our members just a while ago on Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. They were saying if the loss and damage fund is going to be like the Green Climate Fund, we can't wait for 5 years to support communities who are suffering right now, who need water, food, and shelter. And then we need to be flexible because the needs are changing. The needs right now are not going to be the same in 2 months' time or 3 months' time. And we need to be able to be flexible, to have flexible programming, and that needs flexible funding as well. And this needs to happen on both rapid onset and slow onset impacts so that affected communities and individuals can rebuild their lives and their livelihoods in the long run. We're also talking about additionality. So making sure that this is beyond humanitarian funding and that it needs to encompass reconstruction, rehabilitation of non-economic and economic losses and damages that are caused. Inclusivity, equitable access. This is, I think, key because we have a wide range of vulnerabilities that we are working with. Communities are particularly at risk because of either gender, age, ethnicity, minorities, displacement, citizenship status, health conditions, disabilities, and we need to be able to make sure that this is inclusive and it has equitable access to communities who are suffering. Going to leave that for the moment and hand over to Harjeet for the next round. Thanks.
Thank you, Nishani. Next slide, please. I'm going to be super fast now so that we open the floor. So we have a joint call. We talk about immediate action, new and additional climate finance. I'm going to read only the bold part, as you can see, and we'll, of course, share the presentation. We need timely, flexible, predictable, multi-year funding support and not just a drop in the ocean when it comes to really funding needs. Inclusive and equitable access. Next slide, please. Nishani already talked about accountability from historical polluters, but also making sure that the money reaches the intended communities. No double counting and no relabeling of funding. That's extremely important because we are not looking at creative accounting. Creative accounting is not going to help people who have lost their homes, farms, and income. They need real support. That's why new and additional funding. And we want to uphold unwavering integrity in implementing these measures and keeping human rights at the center. I'm going to stop here so that we can use the rest of the time. Over to you, Dharni, to facilitate Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And maybe we can stop sharing the screen. And we're aware that Senator Rahman may have to leave. So if you have questions directed at her, it would be good to bring those up first. And obviously, other panelists can stay to answer other questions. I did see a hand earlier, but I'm not sure. Please, I see one from Will. Please come in and introduce yourself and your organization.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the briefing question for Senator Rahman. I'd like to get a bit more of a sense of how you would like to see this loss and damage fund financed, given the sort of constrained kind of resource environments in many global north countries. Would you support something like a kind of a carbon tax in favor of it? And also in kind of pushing for more countries to be eligible to receive the funds, do you worry that might result in a smaller pot overall? Thank you.
Do you want me to address that as minimally?
Yes.
So first of all, speaking of a carbon tax, I think that's not something we can just throw out there as a tax that will have the same impact on everyone. So, given that our entire premise is based on equity and reaching the goals of equity, a carbon tax can, in many ways, pass on its costs. Pass on additional costs to those that are already economically fragile. And so if there is a carbon taxation discussion on the anvil, it has to be for those who can pay. Now, under the common and differentiated responsibilities, it's not going to be Harjeet or my country or X or Y or Libya or a small island state that should be asked to pay a carbon tax at this stage. We are neither historical nor legacy polluters, or emitters rather. This is my view. It's something that I would obviously be happy to be informed on by other members with their broader views, and a collegial response and unified response is essential when it comes to actually being at the negotiating table or seeking optimal outcomes. Now, when the other thing I want to guard against is other barriers that can be imposed in the shape and form or name of raising investments for raising capital. So those kind of barriers, some can be work as trade barriers, or some can operate as taxes that then eventually get passed on to all of us who are seeking a loss and who are seeking compensations or who are seeking resources in loss and damage. So carbon taxation is a double-edged thing so far, but it can be considered for countries who are only for countries without their passing that cost down the road, either in shipping or tariff barriers that can be done that way. It's already being considered in the EU, for instance. There is a tariff barrier that's being considered. It will not sound like a tariff barrier, but it acts like a tariff barrier for exports from developing countries. So I think this is something that needs more discussion, and perhaps I would be better informed by others in how it can seek to create the balance we are seeking in terms of speedy access to funds and easy access to funds that can scale up resilience efforts in developing countries, which are struggling right now to even build on past gains. I mean, much is being wiped out by climate change. What was your second question? Sorry.
Are you worried that by broadening the amount of countries eligible for the loss and damage fund to receive money, it's going to result in a smaller amount of funding to go around overall?
Well, it may not. I mean, it's a question of how the funds are structured. Actually, our experience with other funds has been that they're onerous, they're difficult to access. They involve competition also sometimes between countries seeking those funds. And then that's really not what we're talking about. And I think it's clear that we mean no more additional loans or pile up of credit on countries, debt here on countries. So yeah, I mean, the pot does not need to be finite. Okay, we're assuming that there is a finite pot. And obviously no pool can be infinite either. Obviously, that's practical. But I think this we're being pushed into a narrow hole here in defining where this money comes from. If it can't come from the international public sector, it is for the developed countries who have who host large profit-making businesses that are also fossil fuel emitters to come up with the kind of surplus needed, whether it's from private capital. How they tax that private capital is their lookout, but they must not be allowed to pass those costs on in any form or shape, either shipping costs, freight costs, tariff barriers, and other blue costs, to when you're sending you're exporting your water. So there are many hidden exports and imports we make in the climate world, and I think that all must be factored in. So it is not, I don't understand why we are being burdened to create that money, to identify it. I'm sorry, that's not my problem. That is not a problem, the problem of a country that is struggling under the emissions and unrelenting, not turning down trajectory of emissions that are setting us on the path of clear Armageddon. But we are in the front line of that Armageddon. It is the job of that country to devise a fund that builds trust between us, that bridges the gap, the financing gap. That is the chokehold on everything, pretty much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I see two hands, one from Joydeep and then Urmi. So perhaps we'll take two questions together. If you can briefly put your questions and then we'll share it with the panel. Joydeep and then Urmi.
Okay, my question's on the chat, and anyone from the panel can respond, because what I can foresee is that the loss and damage fund setting up process was supposed to be 2 years. It's been 1 year, and we are likely to hear a lot of talk that why are we bringing it up at this COP when only 1 year is up? Why not wait for the next year? How's CAN going to respond to this?
Thank you. Urmi, do you want to raise your question as well?
Hi,
Please introduce yourself.
hi, sorry, this is Urmi Goswami from the Economic Times. I have a couple of questions. The first is actually addressed to Senator Rahman. Actually, there are two parts to that question. One is, of course, there's this whole conversation happening about where to house the loss and damage fund, the World Bank versus an independent one. And I was wondering if you could speak to Pakistan's own experience of dealing with the IMF and the World Bank. I mean, because the opposition to housing the loss and damage in the World Bank, I mean, there are reasons that have been given, which Harjeet and Lian have given at other things, but perhaps a practical example of what the IMF and World Bank's interventions have meant for Pakistan in terms of escalating or exacerbating climate crisis. If you could speak to that, if you indeed feel that has been the case. And the second is, how do you respond to a charge made by developed countries often, whether openly or not so openly, about governance issues in developing countries, and that being sort of the reason why they're not so open to providing money, like how loss and damage is also a governance issue. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that. And since I have a moment, I'll just, the other question, sorry, not for you, no, Senator Rahman, or if you finish, I can come back to the question.
Yeah, let's take this, because it will be hard to keep track for me.
No,
So just
I'm going to quickly, because I have to go. Thank you very much for the questions. They're quite thoughtful. I'm going to speak to one or two of these issues. This can't be about Pakistan, the IMF, and the World Bank. Okay, we've had a very long engagement with both entities, the MTBs, and our position has been very clear, even at the Paris summit on reforming international finance, that I publicly say that the World Bank's got to stop loading Pakistan with more debt. So I don't think there's any confusion on that. And of course, the IMF's views, it is now reflecting concerns for structural reform, which is very old. It's not new. And certainly that links to what you're saying about governance. Now, governance needs to, of course, be radically improved in all countries that are seeking to build higher resilience. Okay, so climate governance, governance that speaks to climate resilience is very different from what the development models that and the planning models that many of the developing countries have been following. And I think there needs to be a 360-degree wheel on governance and capacity building there. Many countries don't have the capacity to make that with great agility to make that responsive change. And of course, there are elites that don't like to respond to change. And I think these are thorny questions that apply to many areas. But I do also quickly want to add that somebody asked here about why now, why not later? I mean, I think that's very germane to our task here, collective, maintaining unity and the pressure in terms of time. I'm not from the Maldives or the small island states which are sinking, say, in 8 years. That's roughly what their minister says. Now, do you not see that as an issue of time? And why would we not be raising it at COP? Is this just a fun way of turning up and drinking from eco-friendly straws and bottles? No, it's not. It's got COP and participation at multilateral forums is an opportunity, and it must be utilized as a pivotal and in a pivotal moment of time. And clearly, I think we are at an inflection point in the climate crisis. There is breakdown, there are tipping points. Climate justice is now out there as a bone of huge contention in a world which needs unity and rational choices. So I think time is literally something that we've passed. This should have been settled and financed and capitalized and ongoing many COPs earlier. That's my answer.
Thank you so much. We had any other questions from the floor? Was there anything that the panelists would like to respond to, some of these questions that were asked?
I can start. Liana, you want to come in first? Please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to come in briefly on the issue that Joydeep raised. about basically the process and kind of the I guess the assumption that it'll be multi-year. So I think the mandate of the transitional committee is very clear. It's supposed to conclude its work with a set of recommendations, including elaborated terms of reference for a loss and damage fund that are then to be approved by the COP. So we hope, and I mean, obviously, as you can tell, there is quite some contention about, you know, what the specifics of the terms of reference are. But I think actually extending the TC process to a second year would be obviously a clear failure, an indication that there is no possibility to come to an agreement. And it obviously would belie the urgency that Senator Raymond and others have pointed out. Now, it's also very clear that the full operationalization of the fund, and this is independent on whether you would have that as a standalone fund or whether you would have that hosted by the World Bank with the Secretariat, will still take some time. Just the decision of basically approving the terms of reference does not mean that the fund is operational, and obviously the time frame that will take will depend on a number of the issues. The problem is that things are really not in that sense black and white. They are interwoven, they are interdependent. A decision on the location, a decision on the board composition, a decision on allocation frameworks does have implication for operationalization, and so we can only push for the most ambitious outcome, the one that looks most towards the future, the possibility to evolve and scale up. And again, I think from civil society side as well, we would say this is better served with a standalone fund that can evolve and grow with the commensurate with the challenges that have been pointed out.
Thanks, Liana.
Ajit, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I can briefly respond to Urbi's question, building on what Senator Rahman said. I don't think rich countries can use the so-called governance issues in developing countries to not pay their fair share of finance or even delay setting up funding, especially, you know, and when they talk about governance issues, they always talk about corruption. And I think there are many examples that we can point towards rich countries also having so many corruption cases. So that is definitely not a starting point. At the same time, we also need to recognize that developing countries have a history of colonialism and many structural challenges. And as Senator Rahman said, it's also about providing a helping hand and capacity building, and of course, setting up accountability at various levels, improving civil society engagement. There are a number of ways where accountability at various levels can be increased, and not just raise the issue of governance to then sidestep the main demand of providing money at scale and at speed. So that's extremely important, and how attribution science is making it very clear that climate change is making it worse, and that's the major factor for increasing number of disasters. So I think that's absolutely important for everybody to recognize. And I know Will's question was for Senator Rahman, but I think from CAN's perspective, we can say that next meeting is extremely crucial. In the next week, the Transitional Committee meeting. We know that all issues are not going to be resolved, and this connects to Joydeep's question. Although you know, the decision was to operationalize the fund at COP28, and that's what we will continue to push for. If there are certain decisions that need to be taken later, which can be taken up by the board, you know, that we can understand, because not all issues can be resolved in 1 year. It was quite, you know, it has been quite challenging because we are looking at a number of issues, as Liana shared, which need to be sorted out. But if we can do a good job of at least addressing the key issues, we can start the operationalization. And that's a very important message of hope that we have to send back to communities who are facing climate crisis, that they are being listened to, and how we are going to help them now and in future.
Thanks, Harjeet. I see 3 hands up, and I think Will, Urmi, and then Luis. So yeah, we're running out of time, but if people can stay on for like 5 minutes, those of you who can, Will, please go ahead.
My question was for Senator Rahman, but if she's no longer on the call, I'm happy to let someone else go ahead first.
Okay, thank
She
you.
is on the call. I'd like to know if she's optimistic that there will be any agreement on the loss and damage fund this year.
Right, I think she's left the call, but maybe we can also send the question to her to see if she can give a written response. Urmi and then Luis.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you this, the housing, the fund and the World Bank. I know you've gone through the reasons of why it shouldn't happen. I'm just wondering if there is an example of a fund that actually has been operated like that. Is there a fund which sort of which was set up as an FIF, and basically how that functioned? I mean, because normally the response becomes that, oh, it's for efficiency and speedy, I mean, you guys know the response, the reason why they say they're pushing World Bank. So I'm just wondering if there is something that one can look at, one can refer to as a not so great experience of such a fund. That was my question.
Thanks, Urmi. Luis will take your question as well. And you see one more hand.
Hi, Louise Osborne from Deutsche Welle. I was just wondering, Harjit had said, for example, that the fund should not be based on loans, but be grant-based instead. Given the pledges that have been made for the 100 billion and how many of those are connected to loans, I was wondering what are the chances that this would be fully grants-based for loss and damage? And also, whether it's actually more important to get the fund operationalized, even if that does include loan-backed funding. Just a question.
Thank you so much. So we have these two questions. Maybe Leon, you can take the first one on an example, and then we'll come to Lucy's question. And we'll try and take Subel's question as well. Leon, go ahead.
Thank you very much. There are actually quite a number, but as I said, the problem is that we had a new framework coming up in 2019 that changes things a little bit. So for example, the Adaptation Fund and the Global Environment Facility were set up as FIF, as World Bank hosted secretariats, but under a different framework, right? So the current framework is quite a bit more restrictive. But maybe I can point out where we see some of the challenges and potential, and again, that goes, for example, to some of the issues related to allocation, potential earmarking. If you look, for example, at the climate investment funds, right, which are also World Bank hosted funds, where you have clear issues about eligibility. Not every country can access them. A lot of them are kind of on a restricted or on a program-based area. And particularly crucial in that case is the question of earmarking, because you basically have 10 funds or programs under the climate investment funds, but one, the so-called Clean Technology Fund, which actually just prioritizes mitigation spending for a couple of countries, receives more than 70% of the financial inputs. And that's obviously because it's contributor preference, not country preference of what they would like to see. And this is obviously something that we are very guarded and do not want to see as being replicated in the loss and damage fund. And again, there are usually a number of criteria that work together, but we see that there is quite a bit of danger that could happen if the EU and the US and their proposal get their way. Thanks.
Thanks. I can take up the question from Luis. So Luis, when we talk about funding in the form of grant, how likely is that? That's exactly what needs to happen. The demand from developing countries is very clear, and we need to understand why that's the case. Let's remember what happened to Mozambique in 2019 when it was hit by twin cyclones. It was forced to take loan from IMF. Is that fair? We are talking about fairness and justice here. If we expect developing countries who are facing this climate crisis, which has not been caused by them, and they are now losing their homes, farms, income, and infrastructure, and we ask them to take loan, what does that mean? We are already facing a debt crisis. They are going to be stuck in that vicious cycle of poverty. They will never be able to take millions of people out of poverty, and they are being battered by more and more disasters again and again. So it's a matter of justice. that we cannot expect developing countries to take loan. And we are not talking of development. We are talking about lost development that needs to be recovered. It cannot be loan. And if we allow loans for as loss and damage finance, then we don't need a loss and damage fund. Then MDBs are already providing that money. Then the whole fight for loss and damage fund becomes futile. The reason we want loss and damage fund is because we are fighting for climate justice. And justice means polluters who have caused the problem have to pay to help communities and countries recover from climate impact. So for us, it's a matter of justice when we talk about grants-based finance.
Thanks, Lian and Harjeet. Subel, would you like to come in with your question?
Thank you, Dharini. My name is Subel. I'm with Radio Free Asia. I wanted to ask about the funding. The meetings that have taken so far, has there been any discussion about the money and the danger or the fear of fund for something else like adaptation or mitigation going into loss and damage fund? Has anyone raised this issue, or is there has it been addressed? I wanted to raise this largely because given, like just last 2 weeks ago, I think last week, GCF could not raise their, target, for example. So if GCF could not raise their target, means donors are probably giving less. And now when we talk about loss and damage fund, isn't there a danger of, having even less money for adaptation and mitigation and other things? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Subel. I also see a hand from Will. Is that another question you'd like to come in with?
Yeah, it is. Thank you. Shall I go ahead now?
Yeah, just go ahead.
Nishani, your talk about the humanitarian call to action. I'd be grateful if you'd be able to kind of send that separately. We maybe go a bit more into that offline. But I'm interested in how a sort of a call for action from humanitarian agencies for the loss and damage fund to deliver for immediate relief kind of contrasts with the view of many influential people driving the loss and damage fund agenda who want to see the money used for kind of medium-term reconstruction purposes. It's there's been some worries that people don't want the humanitarian sector to get their hands on what the money was intended for. Your comments on that, please. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Maybe Lian, you want to take the question from Subel first, and others can add, and then we'll come to Will's question. We'll try and keep it brief. We're over time, so maybe another 5 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of the relabeling or financing not being provided additional, and we have pointed out, and obviously it's quite obvious that financing to address loss and damage is not financing for mitigation. It's not financing for adaptation. It needs to be new and additional and on top of that provision. Now that all comes back to really the capacity of developed countries to deliver more financing. So in a way also, so I think I would differentiate there between the willingness to deliver financing and the capacity to deliver financing, right? And I think this is also quite clear. For example, one of the reasons why the GCF second replenishment call last week underperformed and might continue to underperform is because a country like the United States, historically the largest contributor, has not contributed to GCF2, to the second replenishment, has not contributed to GCF1, the first replenishment 4 years ago, and is still owing $1 billion that they had promised in 2014 that would pay. Now, I don't think anybody would doubt the capability of the United States to drop a couple of billions if they so desired politically to do so. They have shown in many other contexts, and we've seen that with weapons support and other things, that they are quite capable of rising and prioritizing a lot of money. The same is actually true with a lot of European countries that have, and nobody disputes that it's not necessary to support the Ukraine, but that they have been able to mobilize quite a big part of money very quickly and willingly, that do that regularly, for example, for bailing out banks, but are not willing to bail out basically people already suffering, again, not due to their fault, by raising the contributions that they could do. And that goes back then to one of the discussions that Senator Sherman also had in terms of the question of taxes or levies or carbon markets. There is nothing that, for example, European countries through the emissions trading systems, would basically prevent them from taxing some of the carbon emissions of European companies more, using some of that money generated, as some countries, but not all of them are doing, to actually target or spearhead that for a contribution to the loss and damage fund. There's also the possibility on a national or a regional level to put up levies. France has done that with the solidarity level on, for example, flight tickets. Just in its own national frame, there are a lot of opportunities for developed country to think about using innovative ways of raising money that can be additional contributions. And the last I want to mention is that a lot of those countries still continue in funding fossil fuel exploration and fossil fuel subsidies, even if just that money that is still being spent for that would be put instead for loss and damage, would be a significant contribution and probably a quite significant loss and damage fund. Thanks.
Thanks, Leanne. Nishani, would you like to take Will's question?
Yeah, Will, thanks. It was one of the concerns that the humanitarian sector has is that funding would be given to the humanitarian sector to say, oh, we are covering loss and damage, and that will be it. And as humanitarians, we have had so much of experience having worked in conflict, protracted crisis where there is no development actors or no development funding coming in for recovery, early recovery, reconstruction, rehabilitation, where sometimes as humanitarian actors setting up health systems or infrastructure, small infrastructure, because there's nothing happening in conflict and fragile context. So we don't want to see the same thing happening for climate disasters and for the same thing happening in climate-induced impacts, where communities need to ensure that they are having their recovery, that they are going through reconstruction, that they are having a rebuilding, that rebuilding is happening in a way that there is more sustainability and that they're built so that they're resilient to face future impacts. And we as a humanitarian sector is not able to do that. That is not our role or our mandate, and it's beyond our capacity at the moment. And we're already responding to so many emergencies and disasters. So this is why for us, we are also concerned, and this is why this joint call with the climate actors and us together to say that we are asking for separate fund, additional fund, adequate funding, and it needs to be obviously accessible to communities who are the responders on the ground as well. So that is why we are also saying, and in terms of looking at why grants and not loans, communities are not going to be accessing loans, right? And this is another burden on them. And this is not something that we're also advocating for. Over.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nishani. Harjeet, did you want to come in with a point?
I'll just add a very short point. Will, I think that's a very important question, and it's important to recognize why we came up with a joint call. And it's not fair to say that the humanitarian community is only covering relief, because we work with the same local actors. We cover the whole spectrum. I come from the humanitarian community as well as Nishani. So, and we are working on climate change issues now. So we need to, and that's why this joint call was needed, to say that please don't divide and think that the humanitarian community is only covering relief and there's another set of actors that are covering recovery and rehabilitation. That's neither true nor fair. So we need to look at increased scale of resources. Eventually, you will see most of these actors are common on ground who are implementing. And that's why we see the role of local actors and local governments and indigenous people playing that role, who are not going to distinguish between immediate relief and recovery and rehabilitation. For them, it's about rebuilding their lives, and we all need to come together.
Great. Thank you all so much. And we know we're well past the time. Thank you so much for staying. And we hope that's a reflection of your interest in this issue. And you will use all the material we've shared today for some important background stories in the run up to the meeting next week in Egypt. And yeah, we'll share a recording with the slides and all the material that we presented today. So thanks everyone for your time and engagement, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.